Welcome, everybody, to another episode of From Paper to People, the Family Cookbook. And this week, first time ever, I have an on-the-ground food correspondent from Wisconsin. That's right, a food correspondent. His name is Rick Leonard. He's a regular listener. He has a wonderful blog called An American Genealogy, and I really want you to check it out. He's also on Twitter, and eventually, we're going to talk about his blog because he's doing some amazing things there. In the meantime, though, he's got a recipe that you need to hear about because I need to hear about it too. We all need to hear about it. So everybody say hello to Rick. Hey, Rick.
Hello. Hi, everybody.
So what do you have for us today? This is history.
Sure. Well, and I'm going to set it up a little bit. It's a simple casserole, but it was, and really goes back to the Johnny Mazzetti episode and sort of the importance in your family and tracing family. We call it Emily's Casserole. And Emily is interesting because she's an integral part of our family, but wasn't technically part of our family. My great-grandparents lived in Antigo, Wisconsin around the turn of the century. My great-grandfather, E.A. Morris, was a congressman, three-term congressman from that area, and was also a property owner, a logger, was involved in the community. And during his travels at some point, and it's a bit of a family lore at this time, and unfortunately Emily's not with us anymore to ask, but EA explained to Emily's father that the environment she was living in was not acceptable, and that it was time for her to come with him. And they effectively adopted her probably around 10 to 11 years old and lived with them and had an interesting relationship. She is about the same age as my grandmother and just a few years apart. And so they really were like sisters. But Emily was also an employee and was a housekeeper and a nanny to some degree, helped in the kitchen, things like that. And so there was a really interesting relationship, at that time, and I've always been fascinated by it. But as my grandmother, the only child, started having children, Emily really became their nanny, and she had 5 boys, 5 impossible to manage boys. The Leonard boys are legendary in Antigo, and we could do a whole nother episode on that. But they, were quite a handful, and my grandmother was not, domestic living was not her priority. She was college educated. She ran in some pretty good circles. They were a family of means. And so really, as I talked to the family, Emily was the one that cooked. And so really, I can think of 2 things that my grandmother cooked. And it was, not really a recipe or sort of a passed down family tradition. But, I grew up eating Emily's Casserole. I didn't know much about it. I knew Emily. I mean, she was alive and she's one of my favorite people. But it turns out that Emily was also really all of these 5 brothers, my uncles, my father, their favorite person too. We have 2 Emilys, children from those boys. And she's really a part of the fabric and the lore. And, I realized later, especially after listening to the episode, that, Emily's Casserole tells a story. It is something that my father loved and was comfort food for him. And as he got married and started building a family with myself and my brother, my mom knew Emily well and knew this was something Dad loved, and she brought it forward, and it became a part of our childhood and definitely a comfort food. There would be times when I lived far away from home that when I came home, Mom would say, well, what do you want? It'd be like, well, chili, local pizzeria, and Emily's Casserole. And it's one of those things that it is not the most adventurous recipe in the world. It is not, I don't think we're going to tell a genealogical story with it per se, but it is definitely Emily coming forward to my children who now eat, a very similar version of it. But
there is an American story here, though, and I think that it's an important one to point up. This is also the story of privilege, of economic privilege, and of sort of American and white privilege, because this young woman, she was a child of immigrants? Am I understanding this correctly?
That's right. She's her parents emigrated from Germany.
Okay.
And we believe that she was born soon after. I will tell you, I've worked the tree, and
I was going to ask.
I can get to 1910, and I've got nothing else. But in all likelihood, and again, you know how the family stories can be apocryphal, but I think it's less that EA was a landlord, which is kind of the way it's told, and I'm willing to bet it's more that Paul Ott, Emily's father, was involved in logging. And EA and his brother-in-laws were the largest landowners in northern Wisconsin for a time, a huge logging operation. And so, yeah, they're definitely immigrants, large family, and apparently, some abject circumstances. But there's definitely, you're right about that.
So one of the things that I think is important to note here is that privilege is about, how do I say this? It's about finance, and it's about being established in the community, and that no matter what, when we look at our ancestors, there's always a mix of good and bad, or of good intentions, but not necessarily the best execution. So you can't find fault for them wanting to help her out, because that's a good thing. And you can understand that they just were doing the best that they could, even though it may not be what we would choose to do today, by putting her in essentially a lifelong position of servitude.
Definitely. And it's something that I've really contemplated a lot. And, I think we all have these moments as genealogists and family historians that if you get to have one more conversation, if you had 1 hour, with anybody, and I can't say Emily's at the top of the list, but I would love an hour with Emily. And the stories that I've gotten, there's some great archives that come with this family. The congressman's papers ended up in my possession, his wife's, and then my grandmother's as well. And you talk about privilege. I mean, she was going to Carleton College, a private, university, right on the cusp of the Depression, and still receiving an allowance. And there was no talk of dropping out of college to make ends meet. I mean, these were definitely people of means. But as I read the documents, and I've not gone through them all, I probably have 1,000 letters that I need to go through. I mean, I'm just starting. But one of the things that I've heard too is that there was definitely a place. They were like sisters, but they weren't really sisters. And she was ultimately help. And so I do have the ledgers that show her payments well into the 60s. And so what's funny is that the 5 uncles, my dad and the 4 uncles, I suppose, the Leonard boys, really looked at her as co-parent, I would say. There was just a pure love and a pure acceptance of who she was. But I don't think my grandmother ever lost sight of the relationship and the dynamic. And I think it was clear who was on top and who wasn't. And I think you're right. I've often thought with Emily, I'm sure on some level she was saved from hardships that maybe we can't even grasp and given opportunities. But on the other hand, never married, never had a serious suitor.
Yep.
And I don't know. I mean, there's a million reasons for that, right? But on the other hand, that may have been what was expected. And so looking back on it, I always adored her. And, that kid, adult, you don't understand the adult world, but I look back on it with a different set of eyes today, which is, I wonder what she sacrificed for that family.
Absolutely.
And I agree with you is that, it was privilege and lack of privilege. And there was no question about that. I know a lot of people that go through family history, you start to ask the wrong questions. You don't want the sainted version of everything. You tend to get pushback. But I will say I've never been afraid of that. And as I look at this, I think you're right. I mean, I adore my grandmother. She was one of the most amazing people I ever met. But I definitely recognize as an adult, there's a more complicated story there.
Oh, absolutely. And I also find it interesting that you too are accepting of the idea of grandma couldn't cook because more was expected of her, in a way, because she was educated, therefore she wasn't going to do home. And that's an interesting, you were obviously raised in that expectation or that sentiment as well. And And when we're raised in that, it's hard to get that out in the wash, you know?
Yeah, and I will say that I think one of the things is that when Grandma went to college, and one of the things I'm finding in some of the personal letters are really anguished letters from her college friends that she was marrying somebody very, I don't want to say common, but I mean, was not an intellectual. And was local. And, one of her boyfriends in college was Governor Warren Knowles, went on to be governor of Wisconsin. That was the level that she was at, and was well educated, and it comes from society. Her
Right.
parents attended many, many balls and social functions in Washington, D.C. and Chicago, and it was very common, in that circuit. And my grandmother always dressed. I mean, there wasn't a jeans and t-shirts day, I
Gloves
the two things
all the time.
Yeah, first of all, she had an impeccable fashion sense, and I'm just jealous. I would love the clothes she had, to share with, people in my family. She was just
Right.
well dressed. I think it was just understood that she always felt that she was destined for something bigger, and that, domesticity was not it. And I think it goes into also that Emily was there. Why would you?
Right.
It is assumed that she will continue that role. And I think what's interesting was it expected? Was it an implicit agreement? My father saved you from a horrific, childhood, and I expect that you will continue to serve me. Was it indentured? Was it willing? She adored those 5 boys. I mean, she absolutely treated them like her own children. But again, I think as you get the time and adulthood, you start to realize that, there had to be more than that. There had to be, you can't just fulfill yourself through someone else's children.
Yeah.
And maybe it's possible, but I think in most cases, it does come down to almost a form of servitude.
Well, I love that you're honoring Emily, and that she's been honored by those children that she basically raised herself, because they named daughters for her. I love that. I love that her food is something that the proximate sons that she had raised their own families on her food as well, and that it's been handed down to you as a kind of a proximate grandson. I think that's really, really cool. And so tell us what's in Emily's casserole. What is this wonderful food?
Sure.
This comfort food, because comfort food, I got to say this for a minute. I will love that people want to come on, because I'm dragging people. I want people to come on. I want you to come on and tell us these things. I don't want you to come on and be all like, oh, well, it has to have like 5 different kinds of wine in it or something in order for it to qualify for the family cookbook. I want it to be a food that is a food that your family enjoyed and ate. And comfort food is really important food. When my mom was ill with cancer, she went back to cream chip beef and tuna potato chip casserole, much to the horror of many people who are like, don't you want a salad? Don't you want to be eating something out of this book for people who have cancer? And she was like, no, I want cream chip beef and I want tuna potato chip casserole. So I think that it's really important. Comfort foods are the things that we resort to at times of discomfort. That's exactly what they're for. That's why they're called comfort food. So I'm really glad that you've brought us a comfort food. So tell us what this is.
Sounds good. So it is, I'm just going to read it out straight. And
absolutely.
It's 3 pounds of sliced potatoes. We slice them a little thin. A bag of sliced carrots, 1 medium to large sliced onion, 1.5 pounds of ground beef browned, 1 can of cream of celery soup.
All right.
1 can of milk. And so I will have to say that when I first got the recipe, I had to reach back out to my mother and ask, what's a can of milk? And some of these old recipes, you never know. And she explained to me very nicely that it's just fill the can of cream of celery soup with milk.
There you go.
So butter a Dutch oven, layer potatoes, carrots, onions, and the ground beef. Mix the soup and milk together, pour it over the top, and it's $350 for an hour and a half. And so one of the things too in my conversation, my mythical conversation with Emily will be, so where did this come from? This does not seem like German immigrant food, although it most certainly could be. It, I spent some time in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and they ate pasties, which were just a Cornish delicacy, but it was really, it was just, pepper steak, potatoes, rutabagas, onions, cheap, easy, stored forever. Put it in a piece of pastry, and it'll keep you full, for at lunch for the full day down in the mines. And sometimes it is that 3 ingredient, and it maybe this does harken back to something that she's modified. The cream of celery soup tips me off that it just seems like something out of the 50s. But if you think about it too, there's no other seasoning. There's no pepper or salt, and I definitely throw in pepper, but I do not salt it with that cream of celery. But
that does that for you, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I thought maybe that's it. Maybe when you're running after 5 kids and whatever else you're having to do, maybe Emily's family's recipe called for basic, good cellar ingredients plus X, Y, and Z. But you know what? A cream of celery soup is just easier. So maybe it is modified. Maybe it does have a little lineage. It also could just as easily be out of Red Book. It really sounds like something out of Red Book, from 1952. Yeah, which is right at the height of these children, who are all full of energy and running nonstop. So, yeah, I wish I knew more about the lineage. I wish, I could tie it back in somehow. But at the very least, I know it definitely has a profound place in my, like you said, almost my soul. My oldest once when it was like age 6, we had a great meal or something. Said, this is soul food. And I was like, this is Ethiopian food. He said, no, it just makes your soul feel good. I was like, okay, yeah, that's legit. You can call that soul food. And,
yeah.
That's what this is too. It just, growing up on it. So I guess it doesn't have to be complicated. Like I said, I don't need 5 kinds of wine and nothing but fresh herbs. Exactly. A good can of celery soup will do what it needs to do, right?
Exactly. And, one of the things that the theory that I have, and I am not a food historian. I don't pretend to be a food historian. I am just somebody who likes to try to figure stuff out and then put the idea out there and then potentially be smacked down by real food historians. But here's my theory. My theory is that cream of celery soup, cream of chicken soup, any of the cream soups that were used in any of these kinds of casseroles that did come from, say, the period of World War II or so, those were replacements for cream sauces that were made with a roux. Gotcha. Because they were quicker and because you didn't necessarily need super fresh milk. In fact, you could use water plus powdered milk and then use the soup in order to make this as a substitute with more flavoring in it and potentially also more nutritional value than a cream sauce. Because I keep thinking about my grandmother who did the Johnny Mazzetti grandmother, who she will forever and ever be known as the Johnny Mazzetti grandmother on this podcast. She made those kinds of recipes because that was what they had, that's what they could get, at the PX when she was this military wife during the war. And so I think that that's probably part of it. And I know that there are some food historians out there, so I'm making an appeal. Food historians, if any of you are listening, please respond to this episode and tell us, where do you think this comes from? Because I would love to know. Where do you think that the cream sauce element comes from? The cream of chicken or cream of celery factor in any kind of a casserole that is a comfort food casserole comes from, but specifically, where do you think that Emily's casserole came from? By all means, answer Rick's plea. We'll see what we can get for this.
That's right.
So this has been Emily's Casserole. And again, I want to thank you, Rick, very much for being here today. And Rick can be found. His blog is called An American Genealogy. He's also got a wonderfully active Twitter account. You know how I love my active Twitter accounts. You're really great about, promoting other people and stuff like that, as well as letting everybody know what your research is. And
Rick is going to come back to us and he's going to talk to us about a project he's got going on that blows my mind because it's about DNA and things that I frankly don't have a great handle on. So we're going to talk about that in a future episode. But in the meantime, thank you for being here, Rick.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.
Great. Awesome. Well, wasn't that exciting? Our very first food correspondent. I don't know about you, but I had a great time with that one. Rick is awesome, and he will be back. So, you want to be on too? You want to come and be a food correspondent? I am ready for you, and I want you to come on too. So, all you have to do is this. Go to AncestorsAliveGenealogy.com, look on the right-hand column, and there's a page for you. It's called Be on the Podcast. That's fairly direct, don't you think? And it's a form. Fill out the form, let me know what you want to do, and we'll talk. Simple as that. All you need is a professional quality headset or a pair of earphones and a professional quality mic. And of course, you need good high-speed internet because bad high-speed internet is definitely our enemy. And that's pretty much it. So have a great week. Feed yourself something comfy, something cozy, and above all, expect surprises.